Where do ideas come from? Well, they come from the process of framing a problem, doing research, and generating ideas. And it's this third part, generating ideas, that we're going to talk about in this lecture. The Danish government design lab, Mind Lab, began life as essentially a facilitator of team brainstorming sessions across the Danish government. But pretty soon, after a few years of doing that, they were quite successful. But pretty soon, they found that it just wasn't enough, that they were helping people generate ideas, but the ideas never actually went anywhere. And so that then in their development, they went through a whole process of becoming much more engaged with strategy and much more engaged with implementation of projects. That's a very common experience for design labs, that ideation, generation of ideas on its own is not really a sufficient activity. Yet, if you ask most people about design thinking, immediately they'll go to brainstorming and sticky notes. As you know by now, that's not what design thinking is all about. It may be part of design thinking, and it's an important part, and we're going to talk about it, but it is definitely not all of design thinking. A good way to start this is to quote again from Einstein, who said, "If at first the idea is not absurd, then there's no hope for it." In other words, what Einstein was encouraging us to do was to think much more broadly than we often do. And what brainstorming is, for all its faults, what brainstorming does, when done well, it can unlock the barriers that stop us from thinking broadly about problems and push us to think in very, very different and innovative ways. And absurd ideas often work. Here's a few, right? Here's a power outlet and extension cord. So it's an extension cord actually built into a power outlet that has been implemented. The famous New York High Line used to be a railway line, disused railway line, which was a place for underground art and homeless people. And it was, instead of tearing it down, which a lot of cities would have done, they turned it into a park, and it's a big tourist attraction in New York now. Container farming or vertical farming, if you've never been to a vertical farm, you should really make an effort to go to one. What it is, it's essentially a low energy way of farming and extremely efficient. And you can especially for leafy vegetables like lettuce and spinach, you can get very high quality products that actually last a long time in the store, and believe me, they're delicious. And then in the Netherlands, there's actually a glowing bike path. So here, those are a few ideas that people would have dismissed right away, at first, but they actually do work. So sometimes it does help to think broadly. By the way, if you're interested in more ideas like that, there is a feed from Yanko Design, YANKO, which I subscribe to, and you get a feed every day of some of the cool designs that are out there in the world. I always find it very, very interesting, and I just to suggest, if you're interested in this, then by all means follow it up. Brainstorming, though, is often done badly, and I'd actually go further than that. I'd say it's more often done badly than well. The problem is that people use brainstorming very loosely to think about, and in organizations, oh, let's brainstorm. Well, what they mean is let's have a meeting, and that's not the same thing. As you'll see, brainstorming, when it's done well, has some very set rules. And you have to adhere to those rules, or else you're just not going to get good ideas. But typically, we don't get good ideas out of what are called brainstorming sessions because of that. You'll see there on the left, there's a cartoon there, the four horsemen of the brainstorm, and these are the classic things that tend to come up. The yeah, but, or oh yeah, well, somebody would have done it already, it was a good idea, or why change it? We're doing it already. Oh, let's have a focus group. Let's write a report. Let me play devil's advocate, and so on. There are many, many ways of undermining good ideas. But the classics are really, I would say, domination by power groups or by individuals, powerful individuals. Don't invite your boss to a brainstorming session, at least in a very hierarchical company. And bosses often have a bit of a blind spot about this. They think they're informal and everybody loves them and so on. But there is an underlying hierarchy, and people self-censor when they've got their boss in the room. So I would keep the boss out of brainstorming sessions, and sometimes I've had to have tough conversations with bosses over that. The other one, of course, is negativity, and the four horsemen thing there is a good example of, or a series of good examples of the way that that is phrased. But it's kind of destructive criticism, cynicism, and any fear of change. So the third one then is status quo bias, right? Well, it's different from the way we're doing it, and people will find any excuse to stick with the status quo. So I would watch for those, for power games, for negativity, status quo bias in brainstorming, and try your best to structure the situation so that those things don't interfere with you. There are a couple of good videos that I'm posting for you. One is the bad brainstorming session, which is funny, but sadly it's often all too true. And then there's a nice video of some IDEO design firm brainstorming, and they do a pretty good job of that. And what's nice about that video in particular is they kind of show the atmosphere in this brainstorming session. So have a look at those. They're a good way of contrasting the two styles. They're very short videos, both of them. I think they're 3 or 4 minutes long each. We're good brainstorming. Let's talk about good brainstorming. As I mentioned, paradoxically, people often think of brainstorming as wild and crazy. Well, it only can operate effectively by having pretty strict rules. And remember what brainstorming is. It is a way of generating ideas, nothing more. Okay, so if you take that literally and say, all we're going to do here in this session is generate as many ideas as we can, then you're on the right track, right? So this is not about good ideas. It's not about ideas with potential. It's just ideas, right? And that's why in a brainstorming session, you generate ideas, but you don't judge them at the time. And that will encourage people to go further, right? So get wild about your ideas and start thinking about things that may never work, may never have a chance of working, but somebody may see something in that idea that may just have a chance if it's combined with something else. You should also challenge assumptions, and I don't mean by saying, oh no, you're wrong about that because you're assuming X, Y, Z. What I really mean is try to think, oh, what's the sort of assumption behind that as something we might build on, right? So we might, if we took that assumption away, how would this idea work? It's all about quantity in brainstorming sessions, more than quality. It's about keeping up the pace. It's also very much about building on other ideas. As you do this, make sure you capture everything. In other words, that you're writing everything down or you're putting in sticky notes, because you'll forget it or you'll lose it later if you don't. The idea of having that, if you have all your ideas up on a wall on sticky notes or whatever, as you go through your session, people can look back at the previous ones and say, oh, that one gives me another idea. And you can sort of keep expanding that way. Get over the wall. One of the things that you'll find if you start doing this is that you'll have lots of energy, and in a good group, you have lots of energy for 5-10 minutes, and then it will fade out. And the reason for that is that you've come up with all the ideas that are easy, right? And so now you have to get past those, and I'll mention a few techniques later for you for getting past the easy stuff and into the stuff that then is more original and more interesting. Importantly, don't criticize ideas, either your own ideas or anybody else's. Yeah, you will have a chance to do it later. In terms of getting over the wall, well, there are lots of ways of doing that. One of them is just constantly, or consciously looking at things from different points of view. If you're maybe coming up with ideas for some sort of user-centered part, let's use coffee shops. We use coffee shops a lot in these lectures. You might think about, okay, so we know this would be a cool idea for coffee drinkers. What about baristas? What would they think about that? What would producers, other stakeholders think about it? And actually role play their point of view. Maybe you could role play a barista customer interaction that encapsulates this idea and see where it leads you, okay? Question assumptions, as I mentioned, using assumptions as ways of building ideas rather than of knocking them down, okay? Being physical, right? Draw it. You can draw your idea on a little post-it, or you can draw it on a board. You could make it if you have some, for instance, Play-Doh, or you could role play it, right? If it's for instance, a service encounter, you could role play what that looks like. That's indeed there's a method called body storming, which is exactly that. It's a role-playing session for service design. Using analogies is one of my favorites, which is go to another world for a while and generate ideas and map back. So for example, what would a barista customer encounter look like on Mars? Okay, or what would a barista customer encounter look like in the Rwandan jungle, right? In other words, trying to take yourself out of the immediate situation into something far, far from that, and then seeing if there are some interesting perceptions or ideas that map back onto your original situation. So you could sort of play this out, a coffee shop on a spaceship, right? You play that out in zero gravity conditions. How do you keep your coffee in the cup and that kind of thing? And then you might find, oh, well, there's some ways of managing spillage, which then you could maybe map back onto your coffee shop as one thought. Asking creative questions, leading questions are worthwhile. So, for example, what's the concept behind that? And so you might have an idea, for example, for school kids to do a project to clean up the milk station after school, right? So that because it always gets dirty and that kind of thing. So what's the concept behind that? The concept behind that is that the milk station gets dirty, and maybe there are other ways other than child labor. Maybe there are other ways of getting the milk station cleaned up on a regular basis. Are there other ideas then that could do the same thing? Staying positive is really important. Building on the suggestions of others, building on their ideas. So then the other way of getting over the wall is typically by now you'll have a bunch of post-its on your wall or your mural board, and then looking back at some of those and seeing are there ideas that spring out of the existing ones that you could use as a way forward. Being energetic, engaging with others, that's something where you have to match this to your own comfort level as a group. Some groups are more introverted, like more quiet time, and that's fine. What you can do in that situation is kind of alternate between, okay, let's take a few minutes on our own to generate 10 ideas each. Let's now share them, put them up, and we'll talk about them. And then as that dies down, you can go back on your own and so on. That's a rhythm you could do, or some groups would prefer just a free-for-all from the beginning, right? So this is very much about how your group prefers to work. So I would suggest that you talk within your group about how best to do that. Great ideas come from play, so make it a playful session. And so I mentioned getting physical, and that's certainly one way of doing that. So here are a few tips. One is to remember your design principles. So the thing about design principles, as we talked about earlier, the design principles are based on user insights or customer insights or even stakeholder insights, depending on who you're dealing with here. And the task here is not to say, well, that one doesn't fit our design principles, but to use the design principles as ways of either improving ideas or generating new ideas. So use them as a springboard, not as a hammer. They're really there to help you, not to hinder you. So I would be sure that you're doing that. The other tip is to get physical, right? So you can get physical with ideas in many, many ways. You can draw them. You do not have to be Picasso. You shouldn't try to be Picasso. Stick people are fine, right? Using Lego is another way. Pipe cleaners, and so on. There are many, many ways. Doing little posters, right? So physically engaging with ideas is a way of engaging another part of your brain and really bringing in a very different kind of sentiment to it all. Particularly prototyping then, rapid prototyping is very much a part of design, and it's I would build it into your your brainstorming. Don't just, I mean, you will, as you refine ideas, you'll focus on prototypes, but I build it into even into your brainstorming sessions. So to give you an example, here on the right, this is, you may see on the slide the word concierge. This is actually from a workshop I did for Mount Sinai Hospital in Toronto, and these are a couple of nursing staff. And what they decided on as an idea was a concierge desk for the surgical department, so that a patient would come in and they would talk to the concierge and tell them, you know, an appointment at 10 o'clock and so on with Dr. So-and-so. And the concierge would have that information and then direct them to the right office. And then once you've talked to them, you come back here and we'll send you off somewhere else. So having one central hub for patients was a very successful idea in that session. And similarly, this was, and what they did here was to prototype that service encounter. So that in the session, they actually ran the encounter and showed what it would look like. So prototyping as a shared activity, it can help foster cohesion within your team and, you know, cross over any boundaries, any differences in knowledge between you. And so what the prototypes do is they help make this problem and your solution to it much more concrete. And if you can do that, then you can improve it, you can refine it, you can see if it really works. Okay, making in its way is a form of thinking, and it's a form of thinking that we don't use often enough in business. So I'd encourage you to really engage physically with your ideas. Prototyping, you know, comes in many different forms. People often have trouble understanding, well, how do you prototype a service? Well, here are some people prototyping a service. This is a role play of a bus, right? And then you can prototype interfaces, and you can see these two on the left, these two where they've simply sketched out thumb sketches of iPhone or phone interfaces. This one, I think, is just a sticky note stuck on top of the phone. As I mentioned, you can use Lego, you can use any materials that you have ready to hand. The next phase of this, so you've done a lot of idea generation. Now you probably have, you know, hundreds of ideas on the board or on the wall. What do you do? How do you pick the one or the ones that you want to go with? Well, first of all, you'll find that a lot of the ideas are similar in some ways, and some of them may be subtly different. So it's not a bad idea to cluster these ideas. So the important thing here is to forget whose idea it was, to lose ownership of ideas as soon as you've stated them. But put them together. What ideas are similar? Are some similar? Are they trying to get the same concept, but just from different ways, okay, or from different directions? What looks really original and exciting to you? You know, what has been done before, it's ho-hum and so on. At this point, you're selecting ideas, so you can be critical. That's why you forget whose idea it was. So as you cluster them into groups, ask yourself, is there maybe a bigger idea here that is underlying everything? And maybe that's something that you need to get to grips with, and maybe do a little more ideation around that. Dot voting is a classic way of selecting ideas. So you can do this in many different ways, but I'll talk about doing this physically to begin with. So what we do is we give people little colored dots, and typically what I will do is give everybody 3 dots and say, okay, now go and select your favorite ideas. So you can do that in your team. And what you're looking for, your criteria, it's an idea that's exciting, you can build on, and really suits your user, and you get a lot of that information from design principles. And then, as I've mentioned, the idea with the most dots wins, or maybe it doesn't exactly win, but it's worth discussing further and refining a bit further. So that's the way of doing it physically in a room when you have sticky notes and colored dots. As a refinement of that, I suggest that you, instead of putting the dot on the front of the sticky note, put it on the back. And the reason for that is that, you know, people will watch what other people are doing. And if a particular idea seems to be collecting a few dots, they will be inclined to stick their note, their dot on top of that. So you'll get a better distribution of ideas, and you get a more honest assessment of ideas by getting people to stick the dot on the back. Now, on Miro, there is a dot voting template. Unfortunately, you can't put the dot on the back on Miro. That's a bit of a shortcoming. But at least you can, use dots as you would in a normal session, putting them on the front, and you can discuss why you've done that, and see where that takes you in terms of further ideas. So to finish up here, after you've selected the ideas that you want to go with, or the combination of ideas, you may select several and put them together. Maybe you found a silver bullet, maybe you've been super lucky, but almost certainly you haven't. You might have got a direction, or maybe a couple of directions, not a full idea until you've really refined it and honed it. And that's the next step: refine it, hone it. And I would start by prototyping. So start, if you haven't already got physical with your ideas, now's the time to really do it. You can sketch them out using stick figures, you can make them, you can role play them, as discussed a moment ago. There's a neat little technique called the itemized response, and that is taking each idea and saying, here are 3 things I like about this idea. Boom, 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 boom. Here are 3 concerns or wishes I have about this idea. Boom, boom, boom. And from there, you can see here, so I can refine the idea by getting managing it or refining it so that I can get rid of the concerns or wishes and maintain or even enhance the strengths, the things that people like. Go back to your problem statement. Go back to your design principles. Is it actually solving the problem you set out to solve? Or is the problem you set out to solve now looking different? Go back to your design principles. Is it really consistent with the design principle? Can it be refined to meet those design principles? Refine, discuss, and repeat. So where do good ideas come from? They come from this iterative process of making, thinking, researching, making, thinking, researching. So going around the circle. It is not a linear process. And, as I said at the beginning, it is one part of design thinking. It is not all of design thinking, but it is it is an important part. So with this, I hope you have the information that you need to start conducting some very productive brainstorming sessions. If it doesn't work at first, keep trying. Find a way that works for your group, because it is a worthwhile thing to do.